In this video, we're going to explore the buildup to the Vietnam War, also known as the Second Indochina War, and why the United States entered the conflict. We'll quickly outline the First Indochina War, also known as the French Indochina War. Then we'll dive into more detail for the years leading up to the first U.S. combat troops stepping foot on Vietnamese soil. The First Indochina War was not simply a colonial war between a foreign power and an indigenous population. It also bore the stamp of a powerful communist movement whose ideological underpinnings, as much as its nationalist motivations, shaped the course of the fighting. For decades, the people of Vietnam had chafed under French colonial rule. Heavy taxes, forced labor, and severe political restrictions ignited widespread resentment. However, the seeds of communism were already being planted among Vietnamese revolutionaries as early as the 1920s and 1930s, many of whom saw in the Marxism-Leninism ideology a framework for overthrowing foreign domination. Ho Chi Minh himself spent time in Moscow and viewed socialism as both an antidote to colonial oppression and a vehicle for establishing a new, equitable society. World War II and the Japanese occupation of Vietnam further weakened French influence. When Japan was defeated in 1945, Ho Chi Minh and his Viet Minh movement declared Vietnam's independence, invoking both nationalist and communist rhetoric. Despite this declaration, the French returned, seeking to restore their colonial hold, and in December 1946, the French Indochina War began. Over the following years, Vietnam became a crucible where European colonialism collided with a rising tide of Asian communism. The Viet Minh's communist identity played a crucial strategic role. Their organization mirrored that of other communist guerrilla movements, emphasizing land reform, peasant mobilization, and political education as ways to gain popular support. Their tactics were shaped in part by the Maoist military strategy of a protracted people's war, drawing on the influence and later the direct support of neighboring communist China after Mao Zedong's victory in the Chinese Revolution of 1949. From that point on, weaponry, supplies, and political guidance flowed across the border from China into northern Vietnam, bolstering the Viet Minh's capacity to launch sophisticated operations and withstand French offensives. On the other side of the conflict, France struggled financially and politically to contain what was increasingly seen, especially by their new ally, the United States, as a communist threat. American military and financial aid streamed in, not only to preserve French influence, but also to thwart what Washington viewed as the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. This infusion of Cold War dynamics heightened the intensity of the fighting, with France effectively becoming a proxy for Western interests in a broader ideological confrontation. By late 1953, France sought a showdown to halt the Viet Minh's momentum. The chosen battleground was Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley in northwestern Vietnam. Here, French commanders hoped to draw the communist forces into a set-piece battle and deliver a crippling blow to a movement they believed might finally buckle if confronted head-on. This was a profound miscalculation. Under the leadership of General Vo Nguyen Giap, a brilliant strategist who closely studied both Soviet and Chinese military doctrines, thousands of Viet Minh troops converged on the valley, hauling artillery through dense forests and constructing extensive trench systems around the French positions. In March 1954, the siege began. Despite the French being well-armed, their perilous supply lines and the geographic advantages held by the Viet Minh spelled disaster for the French. The communist forces steadily tightened their grip, rendering aerial resupply perilous and inflicting heavy losses. Over the coming weeks, the world watched as the balance of power tipped decisively in favor of the Viet Minh. By the time the outcome at Dien Bien Phu became apparent, it was no longer in question that the French colonial enterprise had met its match, both in terms of national fervor and the unyielding, well-organized communist movement that fueled the Viet Minh's campaign. Dien Bien Phu fell in May 1954. The French retreated from Vietnam, and the First Indochina War was over. The Red Star is raised over Hanoi as communist forces arrive. At a Geneva conference, an agreement is reached. It divides Vietnam into North and South, hands the North to the communists, and marks the end of French colonial power. This agreement also sets up the framework for genuine peace in Vietnam if the communists act in good faith. It's a triumphant moment for the communist world, and there are smiles, though not among the over 1 million Vietnamese who abandon their homes and head south, rather than live under a communist regime. Vietnam is split at the 17th parallel, mirroring Korea's division at the 38th. It faces the future with an invisible line stretching from border to border, symbolizing a separation that is anything but imaginary.
My fellow Americans, not long ago I received a letter from a woman in the Midwest. She wrote, "Dear Mr. President, in my humble way I am writing to you about the crisis in Vietnam. I have a son who is now in Vietnam. My husband served in World War II. Our country was at war. But now, this time, it's just something that I don't understand. Why?"
In South Vietnam, peace offers a fresh start. People begin building new homes and new hopes. Free elections are held solely in the South once it becomes clear the communist regime in the North has no intention of allowing truly free elections in its territory. Land reforms in the South grant farmers ownership of their fields so they can harvest the rewards of their own labor. With American economic support, the South begins to thrive, fulfilling the people's hopes for peace. But while Southerners build, North Vietnam is establishing political action centers in their villages, staffed by trained agitators secretly sent from the North, often disguised as refugees. The communist strategy also involves acts of terror and sabotage to destabilize the legitimate government. If the South cannot be coerced under Hanoi's rule through milder methods, the next stage of the communist plan stands ready. Open guerrilla warfare, stealthy and ruthless, aimed at toppling the government and subduing the populace. Hanoi calls it a war of liberation, but it doesn't feel like liberation to the hundreds of anti-communist leaders, teachers and their families who are brutally slaughtered by Viet Cong persuasion squads.
Why must young Americans, born into a land exultant with hope and with golden promise, toil and suffer and sometimes die in such a remote and distant place? The answer, like the war itself, is not an easy one. But it echoes clearly from the painful lessons of half a century. 3 times in my lifetime, in 2 world wars and in Korea, Americans have gone to far lands to fight for freedom. We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost that retreat does not bring safety, and weakness does not bring peace. And it is this lesson that has brought us to Vietnam.
This is the prize the communists seek: South Vietnam, abundant in rice, and situated at the threshold of other rice-rich nations: Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Burma, and East Pakistan. There are also natural resources: coal, phosphate, zinc, tin, manganese, raw materials for building industry. South Vietnam also possesses natural rubber, and it holds the latex processing facilities that turn raw rubber into a crucial resource in our modern world. This is yet another facet of South Vietnam that the North covets, a country advancing towards stronger industrial growth, a tempting prize for communist planners. At Gettysburg College in 1959, President Eisenhower openly recognizes the danger.
We have learned, too, that the cost of defending freedom, of defending America, must be paid in many forms and in many places. They are assessed in all parts of the world: in Berlin, in Vietnam, in the Middle East, here at home. Unassisted, Vietnam cannot, at this time, produce and support the military formations essential to it. Military, as well as economic help, is currently needed in Vietnam.
By 1960, every part of life in the South is a battleground. No one sees this more plainly than the embattled, hard-pressed Vietnamese themselves.
This is a different kind of war. There are no marching armies or solemn declarations. But this is really war. It is guided by North Vietnam, and it is spurred by Communist China. Its goal is to conquer the South and to extend the Asiatic dominion of communism. And there are great stakes in the balance.
By 1961, they issue an urgent plea for assistance. The response arrives swiftly. America pledges substantial military and technical support, providing machinery and equipment to deter aggression, along with trained personnel to show Vietnamese troops how to use them effectively.
Tôi sẽ nói qua về những tiên khách của khẩu súng này.
Instructors and advisors who are ready to impart their knowledge find men whose freedom is on the line, eager and quick to learn. At this stage, however, Americans in Vietnam serve solely as advisors, focused chiefly on training and supporting the South Vietnamese forces they have grown to respect. This guerrilla warfare represents the newest tactic in the global communist strategy. Korea demonstrated that the free world would confront and halt a conventional invasion, and communist attempts to dominate newly emergent nations through trade, aid, and political subversion yielded limited success. Now a new form of politically concealed invasion must be confronted, the so-called People's War of Liberation. As months pass, the communists lose many fighters, but plenty more in the north are sent south to replace them, while others are abducted and coerced into service. Meanwhile, beyond training Vietnamese troops, American advisor teams work continuously to alleviate human suffering in distant villages. With communist aggression mounting, the influx of American equipment and advisors has grown. It is the sole way to counter the swelling tide of infiltration and attack from the north, especially as aggressive guerrillas with no populace to defend can occupy forces 10 times their own size. The Vietnamese soldier quickly masters the techniques of helicopter-borne counterattacks on rural villages, and he employs this new expertise effectively. However, this is not a conventional war. There are no front lines. The enemy can be hiding anywhere and are able to perform persistent and lethal strikes at will before disappearing back into the shadows. Even with advanced equipment and training, American and Vietnamese troops suffer terrible losses. All the while, South Vietnam's military capability continues to expand. American advisors strive to raise the force's training and combat readiness to the highest standard. Yet as North Vietnam keeps dispatching new cadres, South Vietnam's demand for soldiers intensifies. The South's combat casualties are devastating. For a country whose population is smaller than that of New York City in the 1960s. In proportion to its population, South Vietnam's battle losses are 10 times those borne by the United States and Korea, greater even than our total losses in the Second World War. Then, in August 1964, the Communists again widened the conflict.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply. That reply is being given as I speak to you tonight. Air action is now in execution against certain supporting facilities in North Vietnam which have been used in these hostile operations.
Until this point, American forces had never directly struck communist North Vietnam. Later that month, Secretary of Defense McNamara clarifies the situation.
We wish to emphasize we seek no wider war. Our response will depend upon the action of the aggressors, in this case, the North Vietnamese. The key to the situation remains the cessation of infiltration from the north into the south.
We do not seek to broaden the war, yet we see ample proof that the North shows no sign of relenting. In this single-seized cache of Viet Cong weaponry, there are 1 million rounds of small arms ammunition, 3,500 rifles and submachine guns, and about 4,000 anti-tank and mortar shells. And there is no doubt about its origin. The Chinese markings are unmistakable.
Last year, we brought the Vietnam problem before the Security Council of the United Nations at the time of the Gulf of Tonkin affair. But Hanoi refused an invitation to come to the Security Council to talk about it. The distinguished Secretary General of the United Nations, U Thant, considered a peace mission himself to bring about peace, but Hanoi and Peiping told him not to come. Britain has made many efforts to find a path to a settlement. First, by working toward a new conference in Geneva, and then by a visit of one of their senior statesmen, Mr. Patrick Gordon Walker. But the effort for a Geneva conference has thus far been blocked, and Mr. Gordon Walker was told that he should stay away from Hanoi and Peiping.
The communist response to America's proposals of negotiation are a series of high explosive devices directed at American air bases and other troop facilities in the South, including the quarters of U.S. servicemen. In this war, the North Vietnamese target entire populations, not just those in uniform. Saigon's American embassy becomes a harrowing battleground when Viet Cong terrorists target it with a bomb. All of it forms part of a deliberate and ongoing terror campaign against both American and South Vietnamese civilians. Americans have become increasingly involved in protecting freedom in this distant part of the world, where both the stakes and the risks are very real. What once seemed remote now sits on our doorstep, compelling Americans to serve and sacrifice thousands of miles away. To preserve liberty at home, we must defend it in places like South Vietnam.
We do not seek the destruction of any government, nor do we covet a foot of any territory. But we insist, and we will always insist, that the people of South Vietnam shall have the right of choice, the right to shape their own destiny in free elections in the South or throughout all Vietnam under international supervision. And they shall not have any government imposed upon them by force and terror, so long as we can prevent it. We do not want an expanding struggle with consequences that no one can foresee, nor will we bluster or bully or flaunt our power. But we will not surrender, and we will not retreat. Most of the non-communist nations of Asia cannot by themselves and alone resist the growing might and the grasping ambition of Asian communism. We intend to convince the communists that we cannot be defeated by force of arms or by superior power. I have asked the commanding general, General Westmoreland, what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression. He has told me, and we will meet his needs.
United States Marine Corps combat units arrive in Vietnam, joining fellow Marines already on the ground. It's their first landing in full combat gear within an active war zone since Korea. Army combat units follow, sending a clear message by their presence on Vietnamese soil. It is the communists that have chosen this path. And it is the United States that will protect the innocent people of South Vietnam. Whatever the current or future demands of the struggle for freedom in Vietnam, they will be met. For the children of Vietnam and all Southeast Asia, the future hangs in the balance. If they are to realize their inheritance of freedom tomorrow, we must confront harsh realities today.
I do not find it easy to send the flower of our youth, our finest young men, into battle. I have seen them in 1,000 streets of 100 towns in every state in this union, working and laughing and building and filled with hope and life. But as long as there are men who hate and destroy, we must have the courage to resist. We did not choose to be the guardians at the gate, but there is no one else. Nor would surrender in Vietnam bring peace, because we learned from Hitler at Munich that success only feeds the appetite of aggression. Moreover, we're in Vietnam to fulfill one of the most solemn pledges of the American nation. 3 presidents, President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, and your present president, over 11 years have committed themselves and have promised to help defend this small and valiant nation. Strengthened by that promise, the people of South Vietnam have fought for many long years. Thousands of them have died. Thousands more have been crippled and scarred by war. And we just cannot now dishonor our word or abandon our commitment or leave those who believed us and who trusted us to the terror and repression and murder that would follow. This, then, my fellow Americans, is why we're in Vietnam.
Even though we know the outcome of the Vietnam War and how unpopular the war eventually became with the American people, do you think our reasons for joining the Vietnam War when we did were just, or should we have left the South Vietnamese people to fight on their own? Was the spread of communism through Asia really a threat to the U.S., or would it have burned out under the weight of its own ambition? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you've enjoyed watching this brief look into battle history, please consider liking and subscribing. We'll see you again in our next video.